Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of TCG Talk, back today with another video. And in today's video, I'm going to explain to you the differences between Sandscour, Greatbow, and Death Dealer when you're trying to make your bow choice specifically for Azalea in the post-Outsiders format or meta, and just kind of give you the compare and contrast from an arrow perspective, from a pumps perspective, and really just from like a hand perspective, and hopefully be able to give you a reason on why I think Death Dealer is better, but also give you the stats so you can make the decision for yourself as you build your deck. If you like this type of content, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe, especially if you're new to the channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you are new, feel free to look at the Discord down below. We have over 400 members, super positive community, something that's really awesome to get a part of. And if you're a long-standing member of the channel and you want another way to support, feel free to check out my Patreon so you can get access to my videos a day early, as well as some other special roles in the Discord. So I'm going to get into this first. We're going to go over Sandscour Greatbow versus Death Dealer. Now, the point of this, there's been other creators and really well-known Ranger players that have spoken about like the differences. Card Advantage did a really good video on the differences between Sandscour Greatbow and Death Dealer from a value perspective. They more focused on the mathematical side of why one is better than the other and what you have to take into account. They also remained pretty objective when they were talking about it. I'm really honestly talking about why I think Death Dealer is better while also giving you the stats in general, but they kind of focused on more of a mathematical perspective of like value of cards, what's a value worth, and things of that nature. When you're building a deck, I do think looking at value is really nice. Like if this card is worth 3 value, an aim counter is worth 1 value. If you play this line, it's worth this much. If you play this line, it's worth this much. That is very useful. However, in my opinion, a large majority of TCG players they have the capability of thinking that maybe when building a deck, but when you're playing out play lines, very few players are talented enough to think through that value line in their head mid-game. I equate it to almost like poker and counting cards, right? There's people can get taught how to count cards, but being able to do it in game without being obvious and also just being able to do it in general is very difficult. And very few people can do it effectively. Same thing works for value. So when I do this video, I'm trying to look at it from just deck building perspective, from like arrows and pumps and like comparing the bows with the new cards, while also I'm going to give you 4 example hands. And we're going to talk about like optimal play lines. What's the worst case scenario with this hand? What's the best case scenario with this hand? What are the limitations? And what's the biggest advantages and disadvantages of each bow with this specific hand? So we're going to get into that. But first, Sandscour Greatbow and Death Dealer. They both cost 1 to activate their action. With Sandscour Greatbow, you get to look at the top card of your deck for 1 resource. You then can put an arrow from the top of your deck into your arsenal face up, or put an arrow from your hand into your arsenal face up. And whenever an arrow is put face up in arsenal from your deck, you put a name counter on it. So basically, Sandscour Greatbow before Crow's Nest came out in the upcoming set, or is coming out as of tomorrow in the upcoming set for Outsiders, this was the only way to really consistently get aim counters with the new aim counter arrows like Hemorrhage Bore and Long Shot and Immobilizing Shot. This was really the only way to do it unless you ran like Point the Tip and Azalea, which really wasn't that great with Death Dealer. So if you really cared about the aim counter arrows, which some of them had some pretty significant on hits like Immobilizing Shot and Hemorrhage Bore, then this was the best way to do it. You then have Death Dealer, which says if you have no cards in arsenal, you may put an arrow from your hand face up in your arsenal. If you do, draw a card with Go Again. So before we get into the arrows, before we get into the pumps, before we get into play lines and play patterns, what are the base level advantages and disadvantages of each bow? The base level advantage for Sandscour Greatbow is 2. I think you have 2 advantages. 1, you can get consistent aim counters from arrows that you top deck, or arrows that you Azalea ability. And the second one is if you run into a no arrow hand, you still have a chance to have a turn because you can pay 1 to activate Sandscour Greatbow and try to find an arrow on top of your deck. So in those dreaded Ranger no arrow hands, you can do that. Now, I personally think the dread Ranger no arrow hands has lessened with the new cards, but we'll get to that when we get to that. For Death Dealer, or for Sandscour Greatbow, the main disadvantage is 1-cost arrows are very costly in this deck, because with Death Dealer, when, let's just say, for example, you have a Seek and Destroy in hand and a Remorseless. With Death Dealer, you can pitch the Seek and Destroy, load in the Remorseless, draw a card, and fire the Remorseless for 5. You don't get an arsenal or anything like that, but you at least have a turn and you can fire the arrow for 5 without having to jump through any hoops. If you have that same hand with the Sandscour Greatbow, you basically are forced to either A, use Bullseye Bracers to then fire Remorseless for 6, pitching the Seek and Destroy, or B, you are basically forced to pitch one of your 2 cards, hoping that you find a 0-cost arrow on top, so then you can put it in with Sandscour Greatbow and then fire it. That's basically what you're forced to do. Or find a 1-cost arrow on top and have to pitch both cards in order to fire it. Because you can't just pitch Seek and Destroy Sandscour Greatbow if you don't see an arrow on top. Putting Remorseless in Arsenal doesn't do anything because you can't pay for it, right? So it creates some deck limitations. So that's the biggest thing with Sandscour Greatbow for advantages and disadvantages. For Death Dealer, the main advantage is obviously card draw. We're going to get into it in a second when we talk about pumps, but it allows you, on that same hand that I just gave you, it allows you to play off a 2-card hand because you're going to draw into a card, and no matter what, whether your arrow is a 0-cost or a 1-cost, or heck, even a 2-cost with Battering Bolt, depending on if you draw into a yellow or not, you're able to still play that arrow no problem. Another advantage with Death Dealer is you get consistent arsenals. Let's say you have a hand like Deadeye and Drill Shot. You're able to load Drill Shot with Deadeye, draw, doesn't matter what the card is, fire Drill Shot for 4, and arsenal the card you just drew, which allows you to have more Skullbone Crosswrap activations and have more consistency in your deck. It also allows you to Azalea ability can more consistently and have Dominate because you have cards in Arsenal where you can Skullbone Crosswrap, read the glide path, so on and so forth. That's the advantages for Death Dealer. The main disadvantage for Death Dealer is if you do not have an arrow in hand, you quite literally have a dead hand. You can't go get an arrow, possibly with like you can with Sandscour Greatbow. You can pitch into Death Dealer just to cycle cards, but that's essentially, if you don't have an attack or an arrow, that's it, right? The bow itself can't go find you an attack like Sandscour Greatbows can. So that's the main advantages and disadvantages of both bows. So getting into this, before we talk about the arrows and the pumps, we're going to talk about Crow's Nest. This card's coming out in Outsiders tomorrow. I've played with it a little bit obviously on Talishar and played on pre-release. This completely changes the evaluation of Sandscour Greatbow to Death Dealer. Because before, again, the only way you could get aim counters on a Death Dealer build with Azalea was running Point the Tip, which no one wants to run because Point the Tip is bad, especially in Death Dealer builds. You can't Arsenal it. You can't play it from Arsenal. It's just not that great. You have to have a aim counter based arrow in Arsenal to even do anything. It was just kind of inconsistent in compared to the other pumps. Now with Crow's Nest, you don't need to run Point the Tip. You basically have a similar ability to Sandscour Greatbow than you did now with Crow's Nest, because if you think about it, Sandscour Greatbow states whenever an arrow comes from your deck into your arsenal, it gains an aim counter. So you can get an aim counter either by activating Sandscour Greatbow and putting an arrow from your deck to your arsenal, or by Azalea ability, because when you Azalea ability, it's coming from your deck, so it's going to get an aim counter because of Sandscour Greatbow's like passive ability, basically. Crow's Nest literally does the same thing. So with Sandscour Greatbow, you pay 1 to then go get an arrow from top of your deck, give it an aim counter. Crow's Nest, you can, if you Azalea ability, you pay 1, same thing, and you can give it an aim counter. So in a sense, it somewhat does what Sandscour Greatbow does. Not quite as efficiently, but it does do it because any Azalea ability, you basically have the option to do what Sandscour Greatbow already does. So it completely changes it, but we'll get to that here in a second. So the first thing I want to talk about is arrows. Arrows are kind of the biggest thing here, and I'm including the Outsider arrows because with Outsiders new arrows, you basically have 4 brackets of arrows for Azalea. You have non-aim counter on hits. You have aim counter only arrows that basically only are significant if they have an aim counter. You have hybrid arrows, which have an on hit regardless if they have an aim counter or not. The aim counter only amplifies the arrow. And then you have vanilla arrows. So the original argument for Death Dealer over Sandscour Greatbow, because Sandscour Greatbow's argument was you can play cards like Hemorrhage Bore and cards like Barbone Toe wasn't out yet, but cards like Hemorrhage Bore and cards like Immobilizing Shot. And you get cards like Drill Shot that have an add now Piercing 1. And the argument was, well, Immobilizing Shot's good and all, but I have red in the ledger. Why do I care to like jump through a hoop to get another red in the ledger in my hand when I already have 3 good ones and I've knocked the death whistle and, I have Memorial Ground. I can go get more red in the ledgers, right? That was the original one. Then the next one was Hemorrhage Bore. There's not much comparison to Hemorrhage Bore, right? Because it destroys Arsenal for regular arrows, but you have cards like Battering Bolt, cards like Fatigue Shot, Sleep Dart, Remorseless, Hamstring Shot. You have these other arrows that already have significant on hits and they don't need an aim counter to do it. So why would I run arrows that without an aim counter, which is section 2 that you see here, without an aim counter, those 4 arrows do nothing. They're nothing more than vanilla damage. Now, if you mix them with like a Lace with Blood Rot or Inertia, then sure, you might have a little bit more to talk about. But at the arrow's base level value, it's just vanilla damage. And with Azalea, one of her biggest abilities now, especially post Outsiders, when you start seeing people play it more, she has a lot of on hits now. Like almost every single turn is going to have some type of on hit for the most part. And so your initial argument now is, are these arrows in this second section worth enough to then value running Sandscour Greatbow? In my opinion, they aren't, because section 1 is like your core arrows, and then honestly section 3 is like the MVP arrows, because Withering Shot gives them a frailty token on hit. And if it has an aim counter, it gets +1. So it goes to 6. Sedation and Infecting do the same thing. Sedation gives them an Inertia token. Infecting gives them a Blood Rot token. If either of those have aim counters, they get +1. Drill Shot puts a -1 counter on opposing equipment. If it has an aim counter, it has Piercing 1. All 4 of those arrows already do something without an aim counter. So the aim counter is just a bonus. So why not just run them in a Death Dealer list when you can pump them more and more consistently and still give them an aim counter when it's applicable? I would say right now, I've played around 70 games with the new Azalea with my new Outsiders list. I get an aim counter on an arrow probably twice a game, I would say, is the good average. And I think with Sandscour Greatbow, I mean, you're going to have to consistently top deck arrows pretty immensely, right? Like a long game, right? A long game where let's say you have 10 turns yourself, 10 turns on your offensive turn. You basically have to top deck an arrow 5 times in order to like significantly outpace what Crow's Nest already does, in my opinion. So that's kind of the issue with it now, is the arrows that you're going to want to run in Azalea just naturally are in sections 1 and in section 3. And why not run Death Dealer, where you're going to draw into more cards, and all arrows in section 1 and 3 still have significant on hits, even without an aim counter. Right? So now it's like, okay, do I really want to give up the card draw every single turn just to play the arrows in section 2? My answer is no. Some people's answer is yes, but I personally think it's a no. So that's point 1. Point 2 is the pumps. So pre-Outsiders, we had pumps Deadeye, Rain Razors, Read the Glide Path Red and Yellow, Seek and Destroy, Take Aim, and Release Attention. That was like the standard pumps. Post-Outsiders, we're going to have all the pumps I just listed, and we're going to have basically 6 or 7 more. We now have access to Premeditate, Laced with Inertia, Laced with Frailty, and Laced with Blood Rot, Melting Point, Fletch a Red Tail, Fletch a Blue Tail. We have access to a lot more pumps. So because of that, I think you're going to start seeing Azalea, while she can still go wide with Bolton shots and stuff like that, you're going to see her go a little bit taller. Now, the reason that's important is what Death Dealer gives you access to that Greatbow doesn't is it allows you to play 2 things. 1, it allows you to play the pumps more freely, and you'll see that when we go over the hand examples. And 2, it allows you to draw into more pumps, which allows you to have taller attacks. And when you start encountering stuff like Read the Glide Path with Azalea ability, being able to draw that 1 extra pump can sometimes win you the game. The difference between 8 dominate and 11 dominate, because you drew into that 1 pump off Death Dealer, allowed you to kill them when they were at so much life, right? Where you had to push 8 damage, right? Let's say they're at 8 health, and 8 dominate's going to put them down to 3 because they're going to give you a 3 block, but 11 dominate's going to put them down to 8 or 0, obviously, right? If they don't have a defense reaction. You won't draw into that pump with Sandscour Greatbow, but you will draw into it with Death Dealer more consistently. So that's kind of like my second reasoning. And then we're going to get into the sample hand. So I'm going to try to do this very efficiently and give you my suggestions. I am not the best Azalea player in the world, but I like to think I'm a decent Azalea player. I'm going to give you the optimal line for each bow. I'm going to give you the worst case scenario, what my proposed limitations are, and then the biggest advantage to disadvantage, okay? So in all of these 4-hand situations, Bullseye Bracers is available, but we do not have a tunic counter because tunic counter is too goldfishy. There's 2 rules I'm going to have when I'm giving you these hands. 1, I'm not going to show you what you can do on the highest, best goldfish line. You should never build a deck to goldfish. You should build a deck to what the consistent lines are in your deck, because Azalea is going to value consistent play patterns. That's where Azalea is good. She has the consistent, normal play patterns that keep, like, bread and butter that keep going. You can't play Azalea anymore based off these goldfish crazy lines. So in this situation, we have red sedation shot. Doesn't have to be a sedation shot. It can be any 1-cost arrow. The purpose is you have a 1-cost arrow in hand. Yellow Deadeye, read the glide path, seek and destroy. No tunic counter. Let's not use Bullseye Bracers unless we absolutely have to. Let's say it's early game. So for Death Dealer, one of my optimal lines, you load sedation shot with Deadeye. You draw, play read the glide path, see if there's an arrow on top. If so, you dominate it. If not, you bottom it. Play Seek and Destroy. Fire 11 damage with an arsenal because you're going to arsenal the card you drew, whatever that card is. If it's a pump, you could technically play it for 14 damage with no arsenal. That's like the normal optimal line in this situation. For Sandscour Greatbow, what you're probably going to end up doing is you're going to play Read the Glide Path first to see if there's an arrow on top, to see if activating is going to be good. If it's not, if it is an arrow, keep it on top, and you're going to activate Sandscour Greatbow, put it in, obviously giving it an aim counter. If not, you're going to bottom it, activate Sandscour Greatbow with Deadeye. If it's an arrow on top, you put it in for Dominate. If not, you load in the 1-cost arrow, and then be able to fire that off. The difference is you can also fire the Seek and Destroy and make it, again, an 11 power attack, but you get no arsenal because you did not draw a card. Whether you put an arrow in from on top, if you put an arrow in from on top, you can technically arsenal the sedation shot because you are using the 1 resource on that arrow on top, and then play out your Seek and Destroy, fire for 11, and then be able to arsenal sedation. But if you do not see an arrow on top, then you're basically forced to have no arsenal. So you get the same damage that you would have gotten with Deadeye, but you have no arsenal. Now, some people will say, well, what if it's a good aim counter arrow, like a mobilizing shot? Yes, that is a possibility, and hemorrhage bore. However, I'm not going to play off that. I don't want to play Azalea off hoping I top deck the right arrow in order to do well, right? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. It's not a consistent play line. And if that's your argument, go play Rhinar. That seems like it's more your style. Play something that's completely RNG-based, not completely, widely RNG-based, and plays into that. So those are the optimal lines. What are the worst-case scenarios for both hands? For DD, there's no worst-case scenario. You're gonna, no matter what, you're gonna fire for 11 with Arsenal. I guess the worst-case scenario is you read the glide path and you don't see an arrow, so you can't dominate anything. The worst-case scenario for Sandscour Greatbow is there's no arrow from Read the Glide Path and no arrow from Sandscour Greatbow activation, which basically means that you either play 11 damage, no arsenal, or you hold the Seek and Destroy in your hand and play the 8 damage and hold the Seek and Destroy. Now, some people are going to say, oh, you're stacking triggers with Sedation Shot and Seek and Destroy. That's why I said it doesn't have to be a Sedation Shot. It just has to be a 1-cost arrow. Should have honestly replaced this with Remorseless because I know someone in the comments is going to make that argument. So what are the limitations for both? With Death Dealer, there's no really limitation. There's not. You fire for 11 and you get to Arsenal. Sandscour Greatbow is you can't Arsenal if you want to do the full 11 damage because you didn't draw anything like you would have from Death Dealer. That's the biggest limitation disadvantage and of both bows. So what's the biggest advantage and disadvantage of each bow? With Death Dealer on this hand, you can fully push out all your pumps and still Arsenal. The disadvantage is you don't get the double ops with Read the Glide Path and Sandscour Greatbow, essentially. Sandscour Greatbow, the biggest disadvantage is you can't fully push out all your pumps and still have an arsenal, even if you do get an arrow on top, you'll still have to arsenal an arrow, which some would see as a disadvantage in Azalea. It depends on how you look at it. So that's kind of how that is. So that's hand 1. Hand 2. Again, doesn't have to be a sedation shot. It can be any 1-cost arrow. The reason I'm saying 1-cost arrows is because a lot of these are important because because if we look at this for 2 seconds, if we look at the arrows, a lot of the arrows Azalea runs now that are impactful are 1-cost. Hemorrhage Bore, 1-cost. Barb Undertow, 1-cost. Remorseless, 1-cost. Red in the Ledger, Hamstring Shot, Fatigue Shot, Sleep Dart. All of the Withering, Sedation, and Infecting shots, all these are 1-cost. The only 0-cost aim counter arrows are Immobilizing Shot and Drill Shot that you're going to run. No one's going to run Long Shot, I don't think. Personally, I think that's more of like a Riptide card. But 70% of your arrows are 1-cost, which is why I kept adding in 1-cost things in here. So here's situation 2. What are the optimal lines? With Death Dealer, the optimal line is Load Sedation Shot with Premeditate, Fire Sedation shot with the card you drew for 5 damage. The other option is, that's really the best option. Like, that's the only option you got, right? That's really all you can do. With Sandscour Greatbow, your optimal line is activate Sandscour Greatbow with Sedation, look for a 0-cost arrow, put the arrow in play, so basically your optimal line with Sandscour Greatbow isn't really an optimal line. It's the only line you have because this is why I need to stop for a second. You can't pitch Premeditate to activate Sandscour Greatbow in this situation because if you do not find a 0-cost arrow or a 1-cost arrow, you can't play anything. You can't play it because you can't load in the Sedation Shot because you'll have no way of paying for it, right? You either have to activate Bullseye Bracers and fire Sedation Shot for 6 with Premeditate, or you pitch the Premeditate and hopefully you find a 0 or 1-cost arrow on top, put it in, and then fire it. The other optimal, because you have to be able to pay for that arrow. The other technical most optimal line is you pitch the Sedation Shot, activating Sandscour Greatbow, you find a 0-cost arrow on top, you put that in with Greatbow's ability, you play Premeditate, and then you fire the arrow for 7. That's the most optimal line. But again, you're praying for a top deck. This type of hand is the worst hand for Sandscour Greatbow. Sandscour Greatbow really, really, really struggles off 2-card hands because if you have a 1-cost arrow on a 2-card hand, you basically are hoping you top deck an arrow or else you have no turn. You can't do anything. Worst case scenario for Death Dealer, no arsenal from your normal play line. Your worst case scenario is you pitch Premeditate to load Sedation, you pitch the card that you just drew to fire Sedation, you don't get an arsenal, which really isn't worst case. It's just that's the play line. Sandscour Greatbow, worst case scenario is you don't find an arrow on top and you basically have to arsenal pass because unless you activate Bullseye Bracers, if you pitch either one of these 2 cards and you don't find an arrow on top, you literally cannot have a turn. That's like the worst case scenario, which again makes Sandscour Greatbow really limited on 2-card hands. Really limited. You basically have to hope you have a 0-cost in your hand in order to be able to play 2-card hands consistently. The biggest advantage for Death Dealer is you guarantee you fire the 1-cost arrow in your hand no matter what because you're going to draw into a card to pay for it. The biggest disadvantage is no arsenal or ability to Azalea. Sandscour Greatbow, you could possibly top deck a 0-cost card and pitching the Sedation and then fire it for 7 with Premeditate. The biggest disadvantage is you're forced to high roll a top deck card in order to have a turn. If you don't have a turn. So hopefully this kind of makes sense. And this is why from just a play pattern perspective, not from a value perspective, you're A, forced to hold an arrow in hand with Sandscour Greatbow, and B, you're also forced to get a little lucky and have at least a 3-card hand to do anything. If you have a 2-card hand, Sandscour Greatbow becomes extremely clunky. So against decks where you A, have to block, B, have some type of discard effect like Assassin or Guardian, or C, you had to like play out some cards in late game, especially when you're playing off 2- and 3-card hands, you're going to have to be able to do that, and you can't really do that with Sandscour Greatbow. Anyway, go to situation 3. So situation 3 basically is the cards are kind of irrelevant. It's just you have a 1-cost arrow and you have 3 red cards in your hand. Now, Azaleas most of the time run around, I'd say, 43 cost in their decks. If I just look at my Azalea list right now with how it is, we basically, in the main board, have 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 20, 23, 26, 29, 32, 35, 38, 38 reds out of 56 in the main board. Counting the 3 pumps that I side in, I basically have 41 red cards. So having a 4 red hand is not hard at all. So in this situation, what's your optimal lines? Your Death Dealer is not, and I'm not counting Bullseye Bracers with most of these optimal lines. Your optimal line is pitch, seek, and destroy, loading in the sedation shot since their triggers do stack. I would probably pitch, seek regardless. Play, read the glide path, looking for an arrow. If you see an arrow, you Azalea it in, and then you play it. If it's a 1 cost, you'll pitch to premeditate for 8 dominate. If it's a 0 cost, you Azalea it in and you play 11 dominate. If there is no arrow, you play premeditate, and then you fire the arrow for 11 with an on hit, and you still get an arsenal. Or you can play it safe and hold premeditate for the next turn with no arsenal, or you play it safe, hold premeditate for the next turn and do 8 damage. Because if you pitch, seek to load in sedation, you draw a card, you play read, you play premeditate, you can then fire, you can then pitch the card you drew to fire sedation, and basically you're playing 11 with a potential to get a ponder token from premeditate, or you hold premeditate just to be safe and you get an arsenal regardless, right? So no matter what, you're going to be able to play out at least, the bottom line for Death Dealer in this situation is you're going to be able to play out at least 2 pumps. You're using 1 pump to pitch to load the arrow in, but you're going to gain a card to then play that arrow. So now you're free to play your 2 pumps as you see fit. With Sandscour Greatbow, you basically have to play, read the glide path first, look for an arrow. If it's an arrow, then you're good. Let's say it is an arrow. You pitch, seek and destroy to activate Sandscour Greatbow. You load in that arrow from the top. If it's a 0 cost, you can play premeditate as well, and then fire it for basically be 10, and you arsenal the sedation shot. If it's a 1 cost, you're going to have to pitch the sedation shot to then play it, and you get no arsenal, firing for 11. So basically, in most of these situations, as you're seeing, like without getting too into numbers, I don't want people to get lost in the video, you have to hope that you top deck a 0 cost arrow. Because if you top deck a 1 cost arrow, you're not going to get an arsenal, right? So that's kind of the issue. The goldfishy, Sandscour Greatbow line is you play, read the glide path, you see a 0 cost arrow, you bullseye bracer in sedation, you Azalea ability, you premeditate, play, seek and destroy, 14 dominate. The problem is if you play read and you see a 1 cost, you still can have an 11 dominate. But when you're comparing it to Death Dealer, you can do the same thing. If it's Death Dealer and you play read the glide path first to just see what's on top for funsies, you still can do an 11 or 14 dominate turn. So there's really there's no play line in here other than top decking an immobilizing shot or top decking a hemorrhage spore where it's better than Death Dealer. Like there's no argument you can really make. What's the worst case scenario for the line for each of these? If you're running Death Dealer, your worst case scenario is you have no arsenal because you played your full play line. You pitch, seek, and destroy to load in sedation shot. You drew a card. You played read the glide path. You played premeditate, and then you fire sedation shot for 11 with no arsenal. But because you played premeditate, you still have a chance to arsenal anyway with the ponder token. That's your worst case scenario. Your worst case scenario is literally your play line. There's no difference. Your worst case scenario is you don't find an arrow with read the glide path. That's your worst case scenario. Your worst case scenario for Sandscour Greatbow is no arrow off read the glide path and no arrow off Sandscour activations. Let's say you play read the glide path first. It's not an arrow. You bottom it. Then let's say you pitch seek and destroy to then activate Sandscour Greatbow. Look at the top card of your deck. It's also not an arrow. So now you have to load in sedation shot. Well, guess what? Now you have to pay for sedation shot with your 3rd pump. So you only got to play 1 pump for 8 damage, and you basically had to pitch away, seek and destroy, and premeditate. If you decide to play read the glide path first and try to have extra opt, right? That's your worst case scenario. So the limitations for Death Dealer in this line are no arsenal. If you want to play the full line, that's your limitation. Your limitation with Sandscour Greatbow is if you don't top deck an arrow your first 2 ops, you can't play 2 of your 3 pumps, which really sucks in a hand like this. Now you could bullseye bracer, play read the glide path, play seek and destroy, and then play premeditate, then pitch seek and destroy, and you still get pretty good value there because that's now 11. But again, you have to have bracers available, right? And that's a little bit more situational. So the biggest advantage for Death Dealer in this situation is you guarantee that you can fire a sedation shot with at least 2 of your pumps. The biggest advantage for Sandscour Greatbow is you could possibly top deck a 0-cost pitching sedation and fire a 10 dominate arrow, but you're also forced to high roll a top deck in order to play 2 pumps. And then the final one, this is one with an arsenal. The optimal line for Death Dealer is you flip a Sandscour Greatbow, you check for an arrow. If it's a 0-cost arrow, you'll Azalea it in. If it's a 0-cost arrow, you'll play Premeditate. Then you Bullseye Bracer in, Remorseless, Azalea ability, play Seek and Destroy. Now you have a 10 dominate arrow. If it's a 1-cost arrow, you basically can play Premeditate, Bracer and Remorseless, then pitch and play for 7 dominate, or you just do it immediately and you can play 7 dominate anyway by pitching away your Remorseless. It all depends. If it's no arrow when you Sandscour Greatbow, you bottom it, you play Premed, you pitch Seek and Destroy for Remorseless, you draw, play Remorseless with the card you just drew, and you get no arsenal. So the best case scenario is you flip and see a 0-cost arrow, you Azalea it in, you play out Seek and Destroy, and you play a 7 dominate, and you get to arsenal Remorseless. The second option is you see a 1-cost arrow on top, you Azalea it in, you play Seek and Destroy, you pitch Remorseless, play 7 dominate with no arsenal. If you don't see an arrow, you still get to play Remorseless with no arsenal for 8. Like, no matter what, you're going to have a 7-8 power attack. With Sandscour Greatbow, if you flip with Skullman Cross Wrap here, if you see a 0-cost arrow, you can play 7 dominate with Seek and arsenal Remorseless, just like Death Dealer. If you see a 1-cost arrow, you can 7 dominate with no arsenal, just like Death Dealer. If you see no arrow, you can bottom it, activate Sandscour Greatbow with Remorseless, hoping you reveal a 0-cost arrow and be able to play it, because the problem with this is if you flip a Sandscour Greatbow here, you see no arrow. You basically now, you play out Premeditate, right? You cannot pitch Seek and Destroy to activate Sandscour Greatbow, because if you do not top deck an arrow, you cannot play out Remorseless. You basically are forced to use Bullseye Bracers here if you even have them available. Again, another limitation with Sandscour Greatbow. So worst case scenario, for DD, for Death Dealer, your worst case scenario is Remorseless for 8 with no arsenal. For Sandscour Greatbow, your worst case scenario is no arrow off Skullman Cross Wrap op, or Sandscour Greatbow activation, and you have to arsenal pass because you can't play Remorseless unless you use your Bullseye Bracers. So biggest advantage for Death Dealer is you guarantee you fire an arrow no matter what with 1 pump. For Sandscour Greatbow, you could possibly top deck a 0-cost by pitching Remorseless and fire the arrow, but you're also forced to have a top deck high roll. So again, a lot of examples. I wanted to give a lot of good examples because I thought, and some of the examples I might have not even seen all the play lines. So if you're listening to this and you saw a play line that I didn't see, please let me know. The one thing I will say is I purposely did not put Goldfish play lines in, because you should not be building a deck based off Goldfish play lines. In my opinion, I'm not a mathematician. I'm just giving you my suggestion. You basically need to be top decking off Sandscour Greatbow, I'm going to say 60 to 70% of the time in order to equal Death Dealer. I would say 60% is probably the safe bet. 70% is probably like the super safe bet. The issue is you not only need to be top decking, but depending on how many cards you have in hand, you need to be top decking a 0-cost arrow, right? Because if you top deck a 1-cost arrow, if you have a 2 or 3 card hand, you might not even be able to pay for it with a pump, right? Which then lowers your damage output turn to turn, which then now you're saying, okay, that's another factor you have to put into play, because if I have to keep pitching away pumps or pitching away cards in order to play these top decked arrows that are 1 cost, is it really worth it at that point, right? There's a bunch of things to think about with this, a bunch of different ways to look at it. My personal opinion is Death Dealer is better. It's more consistent. Sandscour Greatbow, you're basically hoping for a top deck. And if you made it to the end of the video, I'll put in a pin in the comment down below. Some people are going to say, oh, play New Horizon. New Horizon is just clunky. It basically forces you to have 4 and 5 card hands to do anything with Azalea. Azalea lives off of Opt, and getting rid of Skullbone Cross Wrap, like you're eliminating the potential of double op for Sandscour Greatbow with Read the Glide Path, and you're limiting your just normal play lines when you have consistent arsenals. I would never switch it out. That's my opinion. Some people might disagree. I'll put it in the comment down below because I know someone's going to say something before they got to this point of the video. But yeah, super long video. This is something that took me a while to make, and honestly, 35 minutes is less than what it was when I was practicing it. I was at like an hour. So hopefully enjoy this content. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what your thoughts are. If you agree, disagree, totally fine. I just wanted to do it because I figured like it'd be fun. I don't normally do this in-depth analysis on stuff, but it was something I thought was kind of cool. So yeah, thank you all so much for listening, and I'll see y'all next time on TCG Talk.